John Fowles' controversial debut novel, The Collector, was published in 1963. It was adapted into an Academy Award-nominated movie in 1965 starring Terence Stamp and Samantha Eggers. The Collector is about a young man named Frederick Clegg who kidnaps art student Miranda Grey and holds her hostage in his cellar. Sadly, there are real-life cases of people collecting humans, and we'll talk about 3 of them in this video. But first, we want to bring you a word from our amazing sponsor, Magellan TV. Recently I watched a riveting documentary on Magellan TV called A Shallow Grave. It's about the bizarre murder of businessman Alex Steenkamp. When he disappeared, his wife was convinced she knew who killed him. It was a police informant. She even told the police who killed him, but they did nothing to investigate his disappearance. A Shallow Grave is an unsettling documentary that will leave you stunned. This is just one of the many great crime and mystery documentaries you can find on Magellan TV. I also really like their historical documentaries like World War II, 1941, and The Man of Steel. It's a documentary from the BBC about Joseph Stalin's role in World War II. These are just 2 great documentaries that are available on Magellan TV, and new documentaries are always being added. Magellan TV can be watched anywhere, at any time, on your TV, laptop, or mobile device. You can also cast from your phone to your TV. It works with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, iOS, Google Play, and so much more. Magellan TV has a special offer for criminally listed viewers. Just go to try.magellantv.com/criminally listed and you'll get a month for free. Get access to thousands of documentaries and help support Criminally Listed by checking out Magellan TV. Number 3. Donald Hay. Near the end of winter 1976, 12-year-old Abby Drover lived with her mother and her 2 older sisters in Port Moody, British Columbia, Canada. The family had moved to Port Moody about 4 months earlier at the end of November 1975. Their house was on a dead-end street and there was only 5 other properties on the street. On the afternoon of March 10, 1976, Abby's mother, Ruth Drover, became worried after Abby didn't return home from school. Her other 2 daughters attended a different school, so they didn't see Abby all day. Ruth was concerned because Abby was a good kid who rarely gave her trouble, so it wasn't like her to come home late. One of Abby's sisters searched the neighborhood for her, but she wasn't anywhere to be found. Ruth called Abby's school. She was mortified to learn that Abby didn't attend school that day. At around 6:30 that evening, Ruth reported Abby missing. When one of their neighbors, 43-year-old Donald Hay, heard that Abby was missing, he and his family searched for her. The Hay family lived on the same street as the Dover family. Hay was married to his 3rd wife, and he lived with her and her 3 children. Hay had 3 biological children from his previous 2 marriages. He had been an out-of-control alcoholic, and this led to the downfall of his marriages. His biological children wanted nothing to do with him. In October 1974, just over a year before the Drovers moved to Port Moody, the police were called to the Hay home. Hay was drunk, and he held his wife and stepchildren at gunpoint. He was arrested for the incident, and he spent the night in jail. After a few weeks, his wife agreed to let him move back home. He had promised to stop drinking, but he didn't. He secretly drank 3 bottles of vodka a day. Donald Hay was a talented carpenter, but he had lost several jobs due to his drinking. In early 1976, Hay was running his own business out of his garage. He built campers that could be fitted into the beds of pickup trucks. What no one had realized is that on the morning Abby disappeared, Hay had lured her into his garage. Once he had her in the garage, he forced her into a dungeon that he had built under the floor of his garage. The entrance to the dungeon was covered with a workbench. The entrance was through a cupboard door. The cell was 6 feet by 5 feet, and it was 6.5 feet tall. Once Hay had Abby in the dungeon, he sexually assaulted her for the first time. Afterward, he gagged her, handcuffed her, and chained her to the wall. After the first week, Hay stopped using the handcuffs and the gag. In the damp cell, there was a bed and a chemical toilet. There was also a wash basin with running cold water. The cell was equipped with an air vent, but insects and spiders climbed through it and got inside the dungeon. The food that Hay gave Abby was usually canned, and it was food that was usually unappetizing to a 12-year-old Canadian girl, like sardines. There was one light source in the dungeon. It was a 60-watt light bulb that hung from the ceiling. One time the light burned out and Abby was left in complete darkness. When there was light, she could deal with the insects and the spiders because she could see them and kill them. But in the dark, she didn't know where they were until they were crawling on her. There was also an old radio in the cell. When Abby was first forced into the cell, she listened to news reports about her disappearance. From the reports, she realized that no one had any idea she was locked in a dungeon under her neighbor's garage. She started to feel hopeless when she stopped hearing about herself on the news. Abby realized that people had probably stopped looking for her. Besides the radio for entertainment, Abby was also given books and old Reader's Digests. Donald Hay attempted suicide twice while Abby was locked in the dungeon under his garage. He claimed that he left suicide notes with instructions on how to find Abby. But those suicide notes were never found, and there is no evidence that they ever existed. Abby was frequently starved. At times, she only had ketchup, mustard, and powdered milk to eat. After one of Hay's suicide attempts, he took his family on vacation for 2 weeks. He did not leave Abby enough food to eat while they were gone. Abby's mother, Ruth, grew closer to the Hay family while Abby was missing. She even brought one of her co-workers to the Hay's garage to look at the campers that Hay built. Ruth, of course, had no idea her daughter was being held in a dungeon just below her feet. Months went by and Abby remained missing. When Abby was kidnapped, she was 12 years old. She had her 13th birthday in May 1976, and her family still had no idea what happened to her. During Abby's captivity, she wrote a letter in case she died. She wrote that Donald Hay had kidnapped her and wrote down his address. She then wrapped the note in tape. She wanted the note to be waterproof because Hay told her that he may dump her body in the nearby bay. She then hid the note in the lining of her boot. Abby decided that as she died, she wanted the police to know who had kidnapped her. The longer Abby stayed in the dungeon, the more indifferent Hay grew to her. However, he did continue to sexually assault her every few days. But he had stopped dumping the contents of her toilet, and he had stopped taking garbage out of the dungeon. This only made the insect problem worse. Things got to be so bad that Abby thought about ending her own life. She considered drowning herself in her wash basin. On September 6, 1976, 6 months after Abby was kidnapped, Hay's wife called the police. She thought that her husband had gone into the garage to kill himself. Officers responded and they got into the garage. They saw 43-year-old Donald Hay climbing out of the workbench with his pants around his ankles. The 13-year-old Abby emerged from the hole wearing the same clothes she went missing in. Hay was arrested and Abby was rushed to the hospital. Besides being malnourished, Abby was in fairly good health. She had lost about 20 pounds while she was held captive. While Abby was in captivity, she used a ballpoint pen to mark how many days she had been held captive on the palm of one of her hands. Since Abby had no exposure to the outdoors, she relied on the radio to determine when the day started and ended. She had 170 marks on her hand. She had actually spent 181 days in the dungeon, so she lost 11 days. Donald Hay blamed his actions on his drinking. Hay thought that Abby was being abused at home, and he thought that by locking her up in the dungeon, he was saving her. Donald Hay pleaded guilty to kidnapping in November 1976. He was sentenced to life in prison in February 1977. He applied for parole in 2001, nearly 25 years after he was convicted. He said that the government had already gotten their pound of flesh from him and he should be released. Abby spoke at his parole hearing. She did not want Hay to be paroled. Abby said she would have to live with what he did to her for the rest of her life. Hay was never granted full parole, but he was given regular day passes. Donald Hay died in June 2012 at the age of 79. Abby Drover has mostly stayed out of the news since speaking at Hay's parole hearing. At the time of this video, Abby is 57 and she is the mother of 5 children. Number 2. Wolfgang Přiklopil. Natasha Kampusch was born in February 1988 in Vienna, Austria. Natasha lived in one of the rougher areas of the city. Around the time that she was 6 years old, her parents, who were never married, split up. Natasha lived with her mother and she would visit her father every other weekend. It's suspected that Natasha was abused, possibly sexually, by one of her mother's boyfriends. In February 1998, 10-year-old Natasha went on vacation to Hungary with her father. They returned to Vienna on March 1st, 1998. The next morning, as Natasha was getting ready for school, she and her mother got into an argument. Her mother ended up slapping her across the face. After the fight, 10-year-old Natasha set off for school by herself. But sadly, she never arrived at school. That evening, Natasha's mother reported her missing. The police thought she most likely ran away, so they didn't start an investigation right away. Instead, they waited until she was missing for 48 hours. When the police did start investigating, they talked to a 12-year-old girl who said she saw Natasha being kidnapped. She said that a man grabbed her and shoved her into the back of a white Mercedes-Benz van. She was sure that a second man was in the driver's seat. The police thought that this was their best lead. They questioned over 750 white van owners. One person they questioned was 36-year-old Wolfgang Přiklopil. A detective talked to him 2 weeks after the kidnapping. Přiklopil told the detective that he was home alone on the morning that Natasha was kidnapped. The detective accepted his answer and no follow-up was done. This was unfortunate because when Přiklopil was questioned, he had 10-year-old Natasha locked up in a secret dungeon under his garage. Přiklopil had come across Natasha and he became enamored with her. He had not randomly kidnapped her. Instead, he specifically targeted her because he wanted her to be his captive. Wolfgang Přiklopil was born in Vienna in May 1962. For his entire life, he was a quiet loner. Přiklopil spent the first 10 years of his life in the same neighborhood where Natasha lived. Then his family moved to Strasshof, which is an affluent town outside of Vienna. Přiklopil had a happy childhood and he wasn't abused. But when he was 13, he started to display some disturbing tendencies. This included torturing and killing animals and bedwetting. When Přiklopil was 15, he dropped out of school. He got an apprenticeship with the electronics company, Siemens. After he finished his apprenticeship, he was hired by the company. Wolfgang Přiklopil never dated. He told people that he just wanted a partner who would be completely submissive to him. He wanted a woman who would cook for him, clean up after him, and then leave him alone when he wanted privacy. In 1983, Přiklopil got a job with a telecommunications company based in Vienna. Přiklopil's father died in 1986, and not long afterward, his mother moved out of their family home. She moved back to the flat where they used to live, which was in the same neighborhood where Natasha lived. In fact, the flat was only about a block from Natasha's school. When Přiklopil would finish work for the day, he would go to his mother's home and she would make him dinner. Then they would spend the evening watching TV and looking through old photo albums. Eventually, Přiklopil moved in with his mother and he would visit the house at Strasshof on the weekend. That was until 1991, just before his 30th birthday. Then suddenly, Přiklopil wanted to live alone. His mother would still prepare his meals for him every week. She would freeze them, and then he would warm them up. Around this time, Přiklopil also quit his job. He and one of the few friends he had started their own business. At first, they bought and flipped properties for profit. Then they started event planning, like staging weddings and birthday parties. During the early 1990s, it's believed that Přiklopil started constructing his lair under his garage. The lair was incredibly well hidden. The entrance to the lair was through a hidden trapdoor in the floor of the garage. The door opened to a staircase which led to another room. In that room there was a cupboard. Behind the cupboard there was a metal safe that was embedded in the wall. Behind the safe was a tunnel that led to a specially constructed door. The door was made of iron and concrete and it weighed over 300 pounds. It could only be opened or closed from the outside. Behind that door was another tunnel that led to a small room. That room is where Přiklopil held Natasha. The room was just 6.5 feet long, 10 feet wide, and only 5.5 feet in height. It had a desk, a dresser, a cupboard, and a bed. The room had running water and a working toilet. There was also a ventilation system so oxygen could get into the room. The cell was equipped with electricity, so there was light in the dungeon. The lights were controlled by Přiklopil. He would usually turn on the light in the morning and then shut it off at night. But if you were trying to punish Natasha, he would turn the light off and keep her in darkness, or he would keep the light on all night. During the first half year of her captivity, Natasha was not allowed to leave the dungeon. Because of the isolation, Natasha began to look forward to Přiklopil's visits. She also became terrified when he left the home. Natasha wondered what would happen if Přiklopil were in a car accident or something of that nature. She was terrified that she would be left to starve to death because no one would know she was locked in the dungeon. After the first 6 months, Přiklopil started letting Natasha come upstairs to do things like shower. Later, he had her do housework, but she still spent her nights in the cell. She would also have to stay in the cell while Přiklopil was at work. When Natasha was in the main part of the house, she never attempted to escape. Natasha said that Přiklopil told her that he had booby-trapped the doors and the windows with explosives. She thought if she tried to escape, she would be killed. Přiklopil also physically abused her and starved her, so she was physically weak. In February 2006, Natasha turned 18. She had been Přiklopil's captive for nearly 8 years. Upon turning 18, she was given even more freedom. Notably, she could leave the house with Přiklopil. He would take her to places like museums and restaurants. On one occasion, Přiklopil took her to a ski resort that is a few hours away from Vienna for an afternoon of skiing. When they were driving back home, Přiklopil was stopped by a police officer for a routine traffic stop. Natasha just smiled at the police officer and said nothing. Natasha said that during these excursions out of the home, she tried to catch the attention of people without drawing too much attention to herself. Natasha said she didn't run away or say anything to anyone because Přiklopil told her he had placed explosives on himself. If she did anything, he would detonate the explosives and kill them both. When Přiklopil did take Natasha out of the home, people started reporting sightings of Natasha to the police. The police received at least 30 reports regarding sightings of Natasha, but these sightings were never adequately followed up by the police. Přiklopil then allowed Natasha to work in his garden alone. Přiklopil's neighbors and his business partner saw Natasha working in the garden. They all just assumed she was one of his friends. Natasha claimed she thought about escaping several times. She also thought about killing Přiklopil, but she did not follow through with any of her plans. Then, on August 23, 2006, Přiklopil had Natasha vacuum his car. While she was doing that, he got a phone call on his cell phone. Because of the noise of the vacuum, he had to walk away from the car. When he did, Natasha took off running. She went to a neighbor's home, and the neighbor let her in. The neighbor then called the police. When Přiklopil realized that Natasha was gone, he fled. A massive manhunt was initiated, but the police wouldn't find him alive. That evening, 44-year-old Wolfgang Přiklopil laid down on some railroad tracks and a train ran over him. After 396 days of captivity, which is 8 years, 5 months, and 21 days, Natasha was reunited with her family. After Natasha was rescued, she wrote a book about her ordeal called 396 Days, which was published in 2010. The book was adapted into a movie in 2013. Natasha initially refused to reveal if Přiklopil sexually assaulted her. But then, in 2013, she revealed that she had been repeatedly raped by Přiklopil. There is some speculation that Přiklopil had an accomplice. The girl who saw Natasha being kidnapped has always maintained that she was sure that another man was in the driver's seat of Přiklopil's van. Her story has never wavered over the years. She has even stated under oath that she saw 2 men in the van. She said that the police have pressured her to say that she only saw 1 man. But she is adamant that she saw 2 men in the van. In 2010, at a press conference, the police announced that Wolfgang Přiklopil was the sole abductor and he had no help. One person was notably absent from the press conference. That was the lead investigator on the case, Franz Kroll. Kroll was described as incorruptible. In June 2010, about 6 months after the press conference, Kroll was found dead in his home. He had been shot once in the head. His death was ruled a suicide. Kroll's brother does not believe he took his own life. Instead, he alleges that his brother was killed because he knew too much. He points out that his brother kept a diary. After his death, his diary went missing and has never been found. The police in Vienna maintain that Wolfgang Přiklopil was the only person involved in Natasha's kidnapping and captivity. Natasha has never accused anyone else other than Přiklopil of kidnapping and keeping her hostage for 8.5 years. However, Natasha has been criticized for not being forthcoming with information. Several people, including investigators who worked on the case, have said that parts of Natasha's story do not add up. She has even been caught lying about her story. For example, she denied that she went to the ski resort with Přiklopil. Her lawyer threatened to sue any media source that said she did go on the ski trip. But then, when Natasha was presented with evidence that she did go on the ski trip, she changed her story. People have countered that Natasha was held captive for 8.5 years, and she should not be expected to have a perfect recollection of that traumatic time. They also said she should be entitled to keep some of her experiences private. Natasha ended up buying the house where she was held captive for 396 days. She said that she knows it may seem grotesque, but she did not want it to be a theme park for true crime buffs and doubters of her story. Natasha said she likes to visit the house at night. Natasha also said she still carries a photograph of her kidnapper in her purse. Some people have accused Natasha of choosing to be a captive instead of trying to escape. In the years since her escape, Natasha said she has suffered a lot of online abuse and she does not like leaving her home. She wrote a book about her experiences with cyberbullying and it was published in 2019. At the time of this video, Natasha Kampusch is 32 years old and she lives in Vienna, Austria. Number 1. Gary Heidnik. Gary Heidnik was born in November 1943 in Eastlake, Ohio. His parents divorced when he was 1.5 years old. He initially lived with his mother, but then, around the time he started school, he was sent to live with his father and stepmother. Heidnik had a rough childhood. He would wet the bed, and his father would humiliate him for it. His father would hang out the bed sheets so that the neighbors could see the bed sheets. When Heidnik was young, he fell out of a tree and landed on his head. The fall left Heidnik with a misshapen head. The other kids teased him and called him Football Head. Heidnik was obsessed with the military. His father ended up sending him to military school in the 9th grade. He did well there and he had no disciplinary problems. But it was the first time he saw a psychiatrist because he claimed he was mentally unwell. He dropped out of military school after 2 years and he moved back home. He tried his hand at public school, but it only lasted 6 months. In 1961, Heidnik joined the army. He trained as a medic. In May 1962, he was sent to West Germany and he was stationed at a hospital. Heidnik saw a neurologist while he was stationed in Germany. He said he would get dizzy spells, headaches, and he would vomit. The doctor thought he had schizophrenia. 2 months after he saw the neurologist, he was sent back to the United States and he was hospitalized in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was officially diagnosed with schizophrenia. 3 months later, Heidnik was honorably discharged from the army because he was deemed mentally ill. He received a pension for his 3 years in the army. Also, because he had been deemed mentally ill, he was able to start collecting Social Security. After Heidnik was discharged from the army, he tried to get a career in the healthcare industry, but he never lasted long at a job. Between 1963 and 1972, Heidnik was hospitalized at least 21 times. He also attempted suicide 13 times. This included breaking up a light bulb and swallowing the pieces with water. He also drove his motorcycle head-on into a truck. But several people thought that Heidnik was faking his mental illness. In fact, he had bragged to several people that he had manipulated doctors and he knew what answers they were looking for on tests. One test that Heidnik did take was an IQ test, and he had an IQ of around 148. Anything above 130 is considered high intelligence. In the fall of 1976, Heidnik established his own religion and he declared himself bishop. At most, his religion had a congregation of about 50 people. Using the church as a tax shelter, he invested money in the stock market. Heidnik was a shrewd investor. In 1975, he had $1,500 in his portfolio. He would take the money from his pension, money he received from Social Security, and his religious followers' money and put it into the portfolio. Because of Heidnik's investments, the portfolio would eventually grow to have $500,000 in it. One place that Heidnik invested the money was buying stock in Playboy. Using the money, Heidnik bought himself a 1987 Coupe de Ville and a 1971 Rolls-Royce. In the fall of 1976, Heidnik was living with his girlfriend who had an intellectual disability. An IQ score of 100 is considered average. A person with an IQ below 69 is considered to have an intellectual disability. Heidnik's girlfriend's IQ was around 49. She had a sister who had been in an institute from the age of 14. The sister had an IQ of around 30. One day, Heidnik checked the sister out of the center and promised to return her. But he never brought her back to the center. Over a week later, a representative from the center and a police officer went to Heidnik's apartment. Heidnik claimed he didn't know where the woman was. The apartment building was searched. They found her in a locked storage room. Once she was back at the center, she was given a physical examination. It was apparent that she recently had sex. She also had gonorrhea in her throat. Gary Heidnik was arrested 3 weeks later, and he was charged with an assortment of crimes like kidnapping and rape. Heidnik went to trial for those charges in November 1978, and he testified on his own behalf. He said that the woman wanted to stay with him because she did not like living at the center. Heidnik was ultimately found guilty of lesser charges like unlawful restraint and recklessly endangering another person. He was sentenced to 3 to 7 years in prison. but Heidnik never spent a day in prison. Over the next 3 years, he spent his time in psychiatric hospitals. He kept being transferred between half a dozen hospitals. He was released in April 1983. In 1984, Heidnik purchased a house in North Philadelphia. On the night of November 26, 1986, 25-year-old Josefina Rivera, who was a sex worker, was out working the streets of Philadelphia. Hours earlier, she had gotten into a fight with her boyfriend. Her plan for that night was to make enough money to pay for Thanksgiving dinner for her family. The John she met that night was 43-year-old Gary Heidnik. Heidnik took her back to his home. Once he got her inside the house, he forced her into the basement and chained her to a pipe. Using a pickaxe, he started chipping away at the cement basement floor. Once he removed enough cement, he started digging a hole in the dirt with a shovel. As Heidnik dug, he explained to Rivera that he always wanted a big family. He explained that his plan was to get 10 women and keep them locked up in the basement. He planned to get them all pregnant. After digging for a while, Heidnik went upstairs and left Rivera chained up in the basement. Rivera was able to free herself and she tried to climb out a basement window. When she couldn't get out of the window, she started screaming for help. Someone heard her screaming. Unfortunately, that someone was Gary Heidnik. He returned to the basement and beat Rivera with a stick. He forced her to get into the freshly dug hole. He had her get into a sitting position and then forced her head down towards her chest. He chained her up so she had to stay in that position. Because of the way her head was positioned, she struggled to breathe. Then he put a piece of plywood over the hole and placed some heavy objects on the plywood. To make sure no one would hear Rivera if she screamed, Heidnik tuned the radio to a station that played hard rock music, and he turned it up as loud as it could go. He then left the basement. Rivera stayed in that painful position, struggling to breathe, for 27 hours. When Heidnik returned to the basement, he was not alone. He had 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay with him. Heidnik had met Lindsay years earlier when they were both in a psychiatric hospital. Lindsay had an intellectual disability. When Heidnik got into the basement, he removed the plywood board and he allowed Rivera to stand up. However, he kept her chained to a pipe. For the next several weeks, Heidnik kept the women chained up in the basement. He would beat, torture, and sexually assault them. When Rivera didn't come home, no one reported her missing. Her boyfriend assumed she had took off because of their fight. When Lindsay went missing, her mother searched for her. She also reported her missing to the police. She told them that she thought a man named Gary may have kidnapped her. She even gave the police Heidnik's phone number and address. The police called the phone number that she gave them, but no one answered the phone. An officer went to the house and no one came to the door. After attempting to make contact on the phone and in person, the police stopped investigating. Unfortunately, the police never did a record search to see who Gary was. If they did, they would have seen he was convicted for holding a woman against her will, and they may have investigated the lead further. Nearly a month after Sandra Lindsay was kidnapped, Heidnik brought a third woman into the basement. She was 19-year-old Lisa Thomas. Unlike the other two women, Thomas had never done sex work. Heidnik had convinced her to come to his home, and it would be the biggest mistake of the young woman's life. She was chained to the pipes with the other 2 women. 10 days after kidnapping Lisa Thomas, Heidnik brought home 24-year-old Deborah Dudley. Dudley was different from Heidnik's other 3 captives. The other 3 women were submissive, especially after they were tortured. Dudley, on the other hand, was defiant. To punish her for her attitude, Heidnik would beat and torture all 4 women. Despite the problems Heidnik had with Dudley, he carried on his plans to have 10 women slaves. On January 18, 1987, about 2 weeks after Heidnik forced Dudley into the basement, he brought home 18-year-old sex worker Jacqueline Askins. She was chained up in the basement with the other 4 women. Heidnik had a way of keeping the 5 women in line, but it would keep them from bonding and forming a team. When Heidnik had to leave the home, he would put one of the women in charge. When he returned, he would ask the woman he left in charge who had misbehaved while he was gone. If she named someone, he would force her to beat the woman who she said misbehaved. If she did not name anyone, Heidnik would beat all 5 women. One thing Heidnik really didn't care about was regularly feeding the women. At times, as part of the torture, he would feed them dog food. If they didn't eat it, they would be beaten. Heidnik expanded the hole in the basement. It eventually got to be 4 feet deep, and all 5 women could fit into it. But most of the time, the women didn't have to go into the hole. But if Heidnik wanted to punish them, he would put them in the hole and then cover it with a piece of plywood and then place heavy objects on the plywood. The women spent the majority of their time in the basement. Occasionally, he would allow them upstairs to wash themselves. The women were not allowed to wear clothes while they lived in the cold, damp basement. One day in February 1987, the women were in the hole, and the plywood board was covering them. Heidnik came downstairs, and he caught Sandra Lindsay trying to move the board. He first started punishing her by beating her. But to Heidnik, that wasn't enough of a punishment. In the basement, there were beams in the ceiling. Heidnik handcuffed Lindsay's wrists and then hung the handcuffs from a hook on one of the beams. For several days, Lindsay stayed with her wrists handcuffed above her head, hooked to the beam. While she hung by her wrists, she refused to eat. So Heidnik force-fed her. Eventually, Lindsay developed a fever and started vomiting. Heidnik kept force-feeding her. When Lindsay lost consciousness, Heidnik threw her into the pit. He then served the other 4 women ice cream. Then Heidnik left the basement for a few hours. When he returned, he discovered that 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay was dead. Heidnik took her body upstairs, and then he went out to a hardware store. He returned home with an electric saw. Using the saw, he dismembered the body. Heidnik owned dogs, and he gave them some of the bones. One of the dogs carried a bone into the basement. The dog then proceeded to gnaw on the bone in front of the 4 women. Some of Lindsay's body went into a meat grinder. Supposedly, Heidnik mixed the ground meat with dog food, and then he fed the mixture to his 4 captives. Heidnik cooked the rest of the body. The smell of everything Heidnik was doing attracted the attention of his neighbors, and they called the police. Officers went to the home, and Heidnik told them he had simply overcooked a roast. The officers accepted the answer, and they left. Despite being held hostage for months, Deborah Dudley had not lost her defiant streak. Heidnik tried to break her by showing her what he did to Lindsay's remains. He had Dudley look in a pot on the stove which contained Lindsay's head. He then had her look at what was roasting in the oven. It was Lindsay's torso. Whatever was left of Sandra Lindsay, Heidnik wrapped it in plastic and wrote dog food on it. He then placed the remains in a freezer. On the other end of the spectrum from Dudley was Josefina Rivera, the first woman Heidnik kidnapped. Heidnik treated her the best, and he forced her to join in on torturing the other women. Heidnik tortured the women in several ways. In March 1987, he started using electricity to hurt the women. He would have Rivera put some water in the pit, and then the women were forced to stand in the water. Heidnik would then dip a live electrical cord in the water so that all three would be electrocuted. Afterward, he would make them sleep in the waterlogged pit. On March 18, 1987, Heidnik was electrocuting the women. The cord made contact with 23-year-old Deborah Dudley's chin. She fell and started convulsing. When she stopped convulsing, Heidnik checked her vitals and determined that she was dead. Heidnik wrapped up Dudley's body and put it in the freezer. Afterward, Heidnik made Josefina Rivera write out a confession saying that she had helped kill Dudley. He then had her sign and date it. He told her that if she went to the police, he would show them the confession and she would be arrested as his accomplice. After signing the confession, Rivera got more freedom. On the same day Dudley was killed, Heidnik let Rivera go upstairs to get dressed. Heidnik also started taking Rivera on excursions out of the home. They would go out shopping and dine out at restaurants. She also helped Heidnik on March 22nd when he dumped Dudley's body in some woods in New Jersey. The next day, Rivera went with Heidnik as he looked for a new woman to add to his collection. They came across a sex worker named Agnes Adams. Rivera convinced her to get into the car and they went back to Heidnik's home. When they got there, Adams was led to the basement and chained up with the other three women. After they got Adams chained up, Rivera asked Heidnik for a favor. She wanted to visit her family for a few hours. She promised Heidnik that when he picked her up later that day, she would have another woman with her. Against his better judgment, Heidnik agreed to let her go. On the afternoon of March 23, 1987, he dropped her off at the apartment that she shared with her boyfriend. Once Rivera was in the apartment, she had her boyfriend call the police. Officers arrived at the apartment and Rivera told them about her 4-month ordeal. Initially, the officers didn't believe her, but she was able to convince them that she was telling the truth and they went to Heidnik's home. They were horrified by what they found. Heidnik was arrested and the other three women were freed. Lisa Thomas had been held captive for 3 months and Jacqueline Askin had been in the basement for just over 2 months. Agnes Adams had just been kidnapped hours before Heidnik was arrested. At Heidnik's arraignment, Heidnik claimed that the women were already in the basement when he moved in. But all the women denied this, and they told the police their stories about being kidnapped and tortured. Gary Heidnik went to trial for first-degree murder in June 1988. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Heidnik's lawyer pointed out that Heidnik had been diagnosed with schizophrenia nearly 25 years earlier, and he had spent a lot of time in psychiatric hospitals. Several people testified that Heidnik had boasted about faking his mental illnesses, manipulating the hospital staff, and giving false answers when he was tested. One person who testified was the man who managed Heidnik's financial portfolio. He said that Heidnik always seemed very sharp and in control. Heidnik's trial lasted for 10 days, and the jury deliberated for 16.5 hours. Gary Heidnik was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, among other charges. The jury decided that he should be executed for his crimes. On the night of July 6, 1999, 11 years after he was sentenced to death, 55-year-old Gary Heidnik was executed via lethal injection. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it interesting, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, if you are looking for something new to watch, why not check out my new channel, Chapter Dark. The videos are mysteries that you can try and solve. Do you have what it takes to solve these mysteries? You can find a link to Chapter Dark in the description box below. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.